swept stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight. O'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
My name is George Kniss, been a long-time member here, and I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker. I've been trying to line this guy up for months, maybe years, God. Okay, so Barry Lipson has been my friend for over 12 years, and he, in talking to him to do this introduction, needed a bio from him. Okay, so he gives me a link to a page, a web page. It's like 6 pages long. It took me a half hour to read the damn thing. You know, so I thought, God, I can't bore these guys to death and chew up your time. No. So I'm going to summarize it. Barry Lipson was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, okay? And he went to, he was educated there, economics degree and a law degree. He moved to Pittsburgh here in the early 60s and worked for the Coppers Company. He became a trade attorney. Okay, he's practiced in all levels of the court system, and he's never been arrested that I know of. He has no pending drug charges against him. He sings the Star-Spangled Banner very strongly, and he. Like I said, I've known him for about 12 years. And we get together after these talks here at the Senior Men's Club to have what he calls our schmooze session, in which we talk about constitutional law, we talk about politics, and current events of the day. And if you can imagine talking to a retired attorney, it's very hard to get in your point of view sometimes. So, and I'm a talkative guy too, and we get, it becomes combative at times. But we sit out there, and I think some of the passers-by enjoy our little contest. But we exchange ideas, and it's great. So I'll sum it all up. He has a wife and 2 grown sons. Who are active in our government, actually. And so he's reproduced properly, and they're self-sustaining. And I would just characterize him in one little phrase, a German phrase. He is ein guter Mensch. He's a good man. Barry Lipson, Esquire.
Thank you. Well, it's unusual being in this position in this group. Usually I'm out there with a tender phrase or something like that. But first time I've put on a tie for this group. We start off with the first slide, which shows, I guess, that we're sponsored by KDKA and the Allegheny County Bar Association.
Mr. Speaker, what's the title of your speech today?
Ramblings of an Attorney. You made up another one, but I never looked at it.
Cover the court system.
May I?
Go.
one of the main jobs of an attorney actually is to give pro bono feedback to the community. And this is a system that the Bar Association and KDKA uses to give free legal advice to call-ins. I've also, when I came to Pittsburgh, I gave free advice, and it's worth what you pay for it, of course, to veterans, and I'm now giving free advice to business people as former chair of SCORE, though I can only give you my gut reaction and tell you to see a lawyer to check out anything I tell you, because we can't practice law with SCORE. But anyway, I thought that would be just a nice way to start. But now let's go back as soon as I figure out how this thing works. Let's go to the next slide. Aha! Let's go back to around 1780 BCE. Someone's been around since then, I think George. And we find that if you lived in a certain place in the Mideast, in the middle of the public square was a stone pillar with roughly 283 laws engraved on that stone pillar. And people thought they were pretty harsh. So far, archaeologically, it's the second code we found from ancient times. And it's famous for the quotation, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If a son hits his father, his hand should be cut off. Now we look at that and think that's pretty harsh. But actually, that was a great moral jump forward. If I punched you in the mouth and knocked out a tooth, then this is saying the worst punishment is that I should lose a tooth, not my life. If I took out your eye, I should lose an eye, not my life. If I hit my father, which I guess our kids don't know they're not supposed to do that these days, but back then it was a serious crime, they would just lose a hand. So that was a great moral jump forward and an advancement in law. Let's jump forward now to 1215 AD. If you'll see, there's a rather unhappy King John in the corner of the Magna Carta. And he's pretty unhappy because his nobles are getting him to sign this document, which basically takes power away from him and basically sets forth the main premise, which we should all remember, that whether you're the king or the CEO of your country or whatever, you are not above the law. And this is what the Magna Carta says. Now, as we develop forward, and we're taking big leaps in history, two bodies of law have developed in the world. There are many sub-bodies, but the two main bodies are the common law, which we live under, which basically is developed case by case, and practical situations go into a court of law and they're worked out, and it develops and it develops and it develops. And the main precepts of the common law are basically that you are innocent until you're proven guilty. I like that. And that whatever is not prohibited is permitted. Now, the other body of law is code law. basically thought of the Napoleonic Code, but it comes down from Roman times. And basically, there you have a group of judges and scholars writing out every eventuality they can think of, and you end up with a code of law. And basically, that's kind of the reverse of the common law, because the Napoleonic Code basically says you have to prove you're innocent. If the state accuses you of a crime, you have to prove you're innocent. And what is not permitted is forbidden. So, for example, if there's this luscious lawn in front of the State House, under the common law, you look at it, there's no sign that says do not walk on the grass. You can walk on the grass. Under a strict construction of the Napoleonic Code, unless there's a sign that says feel free to walk on the grass, you can't walk on the grass. Now, these concepts, that the punishment should fit the crime, it shouldn't be greater than the crime, that no one, not even the king, is above the law, and that we look at the law and it develops piece by piece, case by case. A court is also not, under the common law, is not supposed to decide big issues. They decide the smallest possibility, at least in theory. It doesn't always work that way. That is what the world was like to the 13 colonies of the United States. We were dedicated to the common law. We were getting away from a king, and we were innocent unless proven guilty. And we were used to looking at the law and watch it develop, not have a code, a long code written out to say, this is the law, this is what you can do, everything else is prohibited. That's how we went into the Revolutionary War. And in 1776, we created the Declaration of Independence, or our founding fathers did. And forgive me if I don't say founding mothers, but I haven't met one yet. I found one yet. But anyway, here we're basically saying that King George, you stepped too far. Even though you're the CEO and the king, you went too far. You taxed us without representation. You did whatever you did, and we no longer have allegiance to you. You, King George, are subject to the law like we all are, and you goofed. So we're gonna break away from you. Okay, now we had the Declaration of Independence. If you haven't read the papers recently, we won that war. And we start out and we have a confederation. And we try to run a confederation. And we have states running all over the place, and it doesn't work. And I hate to tell you this, but George Washington wasn't the first CEO of the United States. It was the people who were the head of the Continental Congress. He's the first president under the Constitution. Now look at the Constitution. How many pages is that? 1 page. Pretty crammed. I mean, it's the small print is even smaller than my older son writes, and he really crams it on. And all the signatures on the 1 page. Now, are you to tell me that a 1-page document covers the whole code of life so that if you follow the words of that, it'll take care of every eventuality? You're going to tell me that a one-page document can do that, and that you can be an original constructionist, and it's only what the Constitution says that governs you? Or is that a living, breathing document that does get interpreted over time? So it can govern in the 21st century as it governed in earlier centuries. And I'll give you a hint. Lawyers may not be the smartest people on the block, but they've realized a long time ago that you never can cover every eventuality. And so there has to be written so that it gives you the broad principles and then the gaps are filled in. Otherwise, you wouldn't have a document worth anything. So we have the Constitution, a one-page document, and it sets forth the basic outline of how we are to govern ourselves. And it wasn't a perfect document. Women couldn't vote. Now, some people think that's good, some don't. Slaves couldn't vote, and they were only considered 3/5 of a person. Basically, only landowners voted. But even with limited voting, the Founding Fathers didn't have complete faith in the electorate, so they put on an electoral college. Very interesting body. These were supposed to be men at the time, independently thinking. And after the electorate voted, then they voted. And there wasn't supposed to be any restraint on how they voted. They were free to vote as they saw fit, and so they could put in a president who they thought was presidential if they didn't think the current president was presidential. Or if they couldn't arrive at it, it was thrown into the House of Representatives. But then we became more democratic. We'll have to define that word in a minute. And we decided that doesn't seem fair, and it doesn't. They should vote the way the populace votes, especially now that we're letting women vote and people who don't own property vote. And so some states, and states govern the electoral rules, decided that if a majority of their state voted for one person, then all the delegates from their state would vote for that one person. Other states decided, well, if 2/3 of the people voted for one person and 1/3 voted for another person, that our electors would vote in proportion, 2/3 and 1/3, whatever. But basically, whether the Electoral College is good or bad, and I don't know, it didn't do its function, because now it couldn't act independently, and it just acted as a rubber stamp, so there's no real reason to have it. If there's a reason to have it for it to oversee the popular vote, which wasn't the popular vote because it was only landowners, well then, that would see. But that's something interesting to think about. But also, if you think of the legislature and how we're supposed to govern ourselves, we're supposed to really do it by debate and conciliation. We're supposed to argue out the extremes and come basically to the middle ground, and then find something that the majority of legislators would agree to, and that's what we enact as law. That's how it's supposed to work. And that's how it worked with the Constitution. Because there are a number of states, colonies, who did not like this document as it was. Why didn't they like it as it was? because it really didn't include the basic concepts of the Magna Carta. To get that back in. The rights of people, freedoms. And so, the Bill of Rights was adopted. But it wasn't just out of the wind. It was agreed ahead of time, before they voted for the Constitution, that they would have within a short period of time. And this was short for that time. It was a 2-year period of time. They'd have a Bill of Rights. Over 200 years ago, this was, well, let me do it this way. There's someone you know. And what's he holding? He's holding a brochure. I had the honor at the time of the Constitution, at the time of the Bill of Rights, 200th anniversary, to be chair of a Kiwanis and ACLU committee that prepared a brochure explaining the Bill of Rights to everyone, which was translated into Spanish and Russian and distributed throughout the world as well, throughout the United States and also places in the world. We even take some credit for the fall of the Soviet Union, but who knows? Over 200 years ago, the Founding Fathers recognized that while a federal form of government was necessary, the people needed protection against the awesome power of an unrestrained, centralized federal government and against the Platonic realization of what unrestrained democracy really is, to wit, ruled by the mob. To provide such protection and to ensure not Platonic but American democracy, that is instead ruled by the majority with due regard to the minority, which is what American democracy is supposed to be and is today, and which is what makes it unique. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution of the United States were adopted, and to stress the importance of these first 10 amendments, it was known ever since then as the Bill of Rights. But what the, what?
You need a light on?
I can, it's all right, I can see it, thank you. But what does the Bill of Rights mean to us today? The Bill of Rights stands beside us even now as we read this broadside. And it provides my right to pun, which I won't go into. It protects your right to practice the religion of your choice or no religion at all. It protects you from unreasonable searches and seizures and governmental interference. It protects you against cruel and unusual punishment and against unfair arrests and trials. It protects you from testifying against yourself. It limits the power of the federal government to those given to it by the Constitution. It guards your individual liberty, guarantees your enumerated rights, and recognizes the need to protect you and your other fundamental rights, even though they are not specifically set forth in the Constitution. And for those who need pictures, there it is in pictorial form. And if you want to read it in paper, I'm not going to go over it again. But it enumerates the rights. And the right we're going to concentrate right now is on the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment basically says because a well-regulated militia is important, we should not infringe upon the rights of the people to bear arms. Now, if you're a strict constructionist, what does this tell you? That picture is a battle from the Revolutionary War. And now I can get to use one of these. What's that? That's a musket. What's that? That's a sword. What? That's a cannon. So if you can strict constructionist, the Second Amendment applies to muskets, swords, and cannons. 6-shooters and assault weapons and anti-tank rockets, atom bombs, nuclear bombs didn't exist. So they couldn't be protected by the Second Amendment. Because if you're a strict constructionist, the founding fathers couldn't think of them, so they weren't covered. Just so you know, get a better idea. Okay, that's what a flint-like musket looks like. It's muzzle loaded. There's a little piece of flint there that makes a spark that sets off the power. Boom! And 10 minutes later, you can kill your next person.
But it said arms.
Yeah, right.
And specify muskets.
No, but arms didn't. But these other things didn't exist.
Pistols,
so
pistols still existed in.
No, arms meant what the members meant, what the founding fathers knew of as arms. They didn't know of atom bombs. They didn't know of chemical warfare. They knew of ladies' tongues, but that may have been included. But that's what the Second Amendment. I'm not arguing that the Second Amendment doesn't cover more than a musket. My point I'm making is that the Constitution is a living, vibrating, growing thing that is meant to encompass change. And it isn't stuck back as to what existed then, and I think this is a great case in point. One other thing in interpreting the Second Amendment, it is a very strong rule of legislative interpretation that words have to mean something. The Supreme Court didn't quite believe that recently when they read, because of to have a strong militia out of the Second Amendment, but normal rules of legislative interpretation would say that has to have a meaning, which we won't go into now. Lady Justice, she's blindfolded. I won't say anything about her décolletage, but she has scales of justice. That means that every legal matter is supposed to be looked at impartially. You're not supposed to look at the person and say, I like this person, or I don't like this person. You're supposed to look at the legal issue, and you're supposed to be fair. This is the Supreme Court of the United States home. That's the seal of the Supreme Court of the United States. For many years, the Supreme Court didn't have a home, but now it does. Now that's small, but that is Sandra Day O'Connor. She's passed on now, but she was a Supreme Court Justice, and you may recognize the other person with her. I did have the honor of having her acquaintance. I did have the honor of giving her an award before 1,000 people, and I did have the honor of violating the Me Too, whatever you want to call it, by kissing her before 1,000 people. Okay, the Supreme Court is a very interesting institution. It is provided for in the Constitution. it says there shall be a Supreme Court. Now, you have to remember everything I told you about the common law if you don't understand what happened. Otherwise, you think it was a great usurping of power. But there was a case called Marlborough v. Madison very early on in 1803. And let's not jump ahead of us. And Marlborough had been appointed a federal judge by President Adams the night before President Adams was to leave office. And under the law, before he could assume his powers, his warrant of authority had to be delivered to him. And that was the job of the new Secretary of State of President Jefferson, Madison. And Madison wouldn't deliver this warrant of authority to Marlborough because he thought this was kind of underhanded to stuff the federal judiciary the day before the guy left office. So the matter went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court examined the facts and determined that, yes, Marlborough was entitled to his warrant of authority. It was a valid warrant of authority. But they determined that they did not have the authority to tell Madison to give it to him. Now, back in the same year as the Bill of Rights was adopted, 1789, Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1789. Very clever name. And in it, they said, well, Supreme Court, we're going to give you the right of issuing writs of mandamus. A writ of mandamus is a writ that a court says to someone, a government official, you must do this. Writ of mandamus. But the Supreme Court, after deciding that Marlborough was entitled to his warrant of authority, it decided it could not order Madison to give it to him because the Constitution did not give the Supreme Court the right to issue writs of mandamus, and Congress did not have the authority to give to the Supreme Court more authority than the Constitution gave it. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying? So the Supreme Court said, sorry, Congress, you can't make us more powerful. And by doing so, it made itself much more powerful because what it decided was that it was the final arbiter of what the Constitution said, and it could determine what the Constitution said. And with regard to the writ of mandamus, it didn't say we can do it, so we can't exercise that power, but we can exercise the power of telling you what the Constitution means. Now you may say, well, that's a great usurping of power by the Supreme Court. But you have to remember that we are the common law system. And this is what courts had been doing for hundreds of years. And so the Supreme Court, while it gave itself the power to interpret the Constitution, that's what it was supposed to be doing because we're a common law system. If we were a Napoleonic Code system, I would be arguing otherwise. Okay, now we jump forward from 1803 to 2019 or 2018. 2018. You can hardly read it because it's probably going to turn out to be a small footnote in history. But as I already told you, I'm not that concerned about me having violated Me Too. Okay? Because that's the way I was brought up. I'm not that excited that a 17-year-old boy kept his hands above clothing and tried something, allegedly. Or that one report said he belonged to a Yale club that said no means yes. And it also had a little more color to it than that. That's how most of us were brought up. If a woman or a girl, when we were 17, said no, we thought of it as maybe. That's how I'm not concerned. He was a 17-year-old guy. What I am concerned about is whether or not he lied to Congress. That is a very serious crime. It is serious for any one of us to do it. It is even more serious for an appellate judge to do it. And that would be grounds for impeachment if he did lie before Congress. We'll talk about that in a minute. But, I don't know if he did or he didn't. I know as a lawyer that absolute statements are usually false. I never drank before I was 18. If someone said that to me, I would doubt it. And if someone said that to me, whose yearbook talked about him drinking, I would doubt it even. So the question is, did he lie to Congress or not? And that may be future grounds for impeachment. Now, don't get too excited about impeachment. Impeachment is not such a big thing. It sounds big. What all impeachment is the equivalent of an indictment. And all an indictment says, and we think that's horrible too, but all it says, if the grand jury, the trier of fact at that time, hears only one side of a story, and it's more likely than not that hearing only one side of the story that you'll be convicted, then that's enough to indict you. When you go on to be tried, not only do you have a chance to put in a defense, but then the new trier of fact has to decide that a preponderance of the evidence is what decides if you're guilty or not. A preponderance of the evidence, as a rule of thumb, is 90% of the evidence says you're guilty, basically. Now, with impeachments, it's even further afield than that, because in impeachment, you're not going normally before an impartial trier of fact, unless what you did is so shocking that you get beyond party lines. It's a political process too. So impeachment is easy, relatively. In fact, Clinton went through impeachment and he was more popular afterwards than before. But if Kavanaugh lied to Congress, he probably should be impeached. And if he lied to Congress, he probably should be removed. But that's for future determination. Okay, that's basically what the Supreme Court is, the top court of the land. We have these other courts that go up to it. We have 12 circuit courts. We have 94 district courts. I've argued before the I've been before the Supreme Court, and I have a perfect record before the Supreme Court. I've lost everything. I am admitted to the U.S. Circuit Courts for the Second and Third Circuit, the District Courts in Pennsylvania and New York City, the U.S. Court of Military Appeals. But basically, this is how the system works. When you're before the district court, you have a right of appeal to the circuit court. So you have one right of appeal. To go from the circuit court up to the Supreme Court, well, about 7,000 to 8,000 cases want to go before the Supreme Court each year. They take 80 in argument, for oral argument, and they dispose one way or another, like sending them back down or something like that, another 100. So your odds of going before the Supreme Court are rather slim to none. And when you hear the Supreme Court didn't take a case, that's not monumental one way or another. What it does say is that whatever the Court of Appeals or the lower court said stands and is the law of the land with regard to that case. Now we need to have a little, see if you're awake. We talk about the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is supreme in the federal system. It's not supreme in the state system. So, for example, if you are on a state matter before a state court, the highest court of that state hears the case. Supreme Court of the United States has nothing to do with it. Now, one of the cases I went before the Supreme Court had to do with had to do with double jeopardy. Double jeopardy is a right you have under the Bill of Rights, which said you can't be tried twice for the same crime. Makes sense, sounds good. And I went before the Supreme Court and I argued that in a bank robbery, both the state and the federal government shouldn't be able to try you and convict you and send you to jail for the same bank robbery, even if you happen to be Bonnie and Clyde. Well, the Supreme Court didn't agree with me. They said, yes, double jeopardy is the law of the land, but in the United States of America, we don't have one sovereign, we have 51 sovereigns. Each state is sovereign, and the governor of the state is the CEO of that state, and the United States is sovereign. And so two sovereigns can try you for the same bank robbery. And double jeopardy doesn't apply, even though if George doesn't agree. Now, let's say, if you've noticed that the states have prosecuted people for various crimes, and then the federal government comes in and tries them for the same crime, and they call it a violation of civil rights. Well, that's under the same concept. It's two different sovereigns. So they can look at the same facts and say they add up to the same or different crimes, but still, since they're two sovereigns, they can do that. That's kind of interesting. That's why, for example, while the CEO of the United States has what may turn out to be the absolute right of pardon, we don't know that yet, but he may, that's only with regard to federal offenses. the state of New York can convict anyone, including the CEO, and he wouldn't have the right to pardon them from the New York State violation or the Virginia violation. So that's an interesting twist. And that comes from the concept that covers double jeopardy, that we're dealing with different sovereigns. Now, as we said, this is the home of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And that's the seal of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. It has had its own home for much longer than the Supreme Court has. And indeed, as you can see, if you can read that, its seal says it goes back to 1722. So it's much older than the U.S. Supreme Court. Interestingly enough, in New York State, the Supreme Court of New York State, as we know it in Pennsylvania, is called the Court of Appeals, and what we call the Common Pleas Court in New York State is called the Supreme Court, because it's the Supreme Court of general jurisdiction. It's a trial court. So if that doesn't confuse you, I'll try to do better on the next items. Okay. This is basically the setup of the Pennsylvania Supreme Courts. 7 justices. Went the wrong way. You're getting a preview, guys.
You're going the wrong way.
Yeah. I knew I could. Okay. There are 7 justices on the. We did that. There we go. 7 justices on the Supreme Court. Superior Court hears all matters that don't involve government, and they appeal up to the Supreme Court. The Commonwealth Court hears matters that involve government, and it appeals up to the Supreme Court. When I moved to Pennsylvania, they had just created the Commonwealth Court, so I got a rather low number as a lawyer's practicing before that court, for what it was worth. And then we have a whole system of minor judiciary. In fact, this is the Sewickley area. You see all those red marks? That's all the minor judiciary. So feel warm and cuddly. They got you well covered. There's the nearest one to where we are. But what's this redo button? Very interesting. These courts have jurisdictions ranging, say, from $8,000 to $10,000, and they take care of a landlord and tenant things and all kinds of things. They don't have to be lawyers. And you can go and you can fight before them and have all kinds of fun. Or you can completely ignore them. Because whether you go before them and lose, or don't bother to go before them when you're summoned before them, you have a right to redo and to appeal ab initio from the beginning with a new trial to anything they do to the Court of Common Pleas, one level up. The only discouraging factor, and it has discouraged people, is that to appeal up to the Court of Common Pleas, you have to pay fees and et cetera. And sometimes those fees are higher than it's worth it to accept what the minor judiciary has done. Now, one interesting matter that I got involved in was the Ambridge traffic ticket. And it was written in such an interesting way that the Beaver County Times wrote about it, what I had to say about it. But basically, the traffic ticket was drafted so that you read it and you thought you were guilty and you couldn't do anything about it and you had to pay. And if you wanted to plead guilty, the fine was greater than if you pled innocent. So that was also a discouragement. I thought it was unconstitutional, and some people also did. I don't know what's happened to it now and if it's been changed or not. But I know at one time the ACLU was looking at it. Just in case you didn't know, this is Judge Judy, and she is not a real judge. Let's remember that. She is not a real judge. And you're paid to go before her. And another thing that you need to know is that fake news is older than the 21st century. We had it even back in George Washington's time. And I hate to tell you that, but the cherry trees were safe from him. He was not a mass murderer of cherry trees. Okay, now we have the legislature. We have a bicameral legislature. That means two houses. We have a House of Representatives. We have a Senate. And one side is the Senate, one side is the House. And I don't know which side is which. And sometimes they don't know which side is which. Sometimes they don't even know which side is up. But anyway, we have a House of Representatives, which is made up, where the representatives are selected by population, which means that a state like California or New York can have many, many representatives, and a state like Maine may only have one. And a Commonwealth or a territory like Puerto Rico has a non-voting representative. They can be on committees, but they can't vote. Then there's the Senate. And here we were fair to the colonies. Each colony, or as we call it now, states, got two senators, no matter how small they are, Maine, how big they are, California. There was talk about dividing California into 3 states so they'd have 6 senators, but nothing's coming of that I know of. And this is supposed to be a collegiate body. It's supposed to discuss things and come to the middle ground and govern. It's supposed to be nice and peaceful like this. And this is a picture, actually, of a joint session of both houses involving Obamacare. No one's killing anyone there. But just so you know, we have had some excitement within Congress. This was from 1789. And not only were they yelling at each other, they were hitting each other with crutches and all kinds of stuff. So, I mean, having a cantankerous Congress isn't anything new. What worked out the way it wasn't supposed to work out, and I'm not saying if it's good or bad, just fact, is that we ended up having a two-party system governing the country. Now, the Founding Fathers, and there weren't any Founding Fathers that we know about, but the Founding Fathers never envisioned that we turn into a two-party system. If you look at Parliament in Europe and around the world, well, there may be a predominant party, there are a number of parties. But we have a two-party system. And when they forget they're supposed to be friendly and treat each other like gentlemen and ladies and get cantankerous, we have this going. And they divide up by party lines and nothing happens. And that can't be the way to govern. Now, I've written an article called The Great Middleizer, which talks about Supreme Court justices and even legislators. The longer they are in sitting on the bench or in government, the more they come to the middle, because they begin to look at their place in history. They're less beholden to those people who put them there, etc. But let's get back to Congress. Congress actually is the most powerful, or could be the most powerful body in the country. More powerful than the president, more powerful than the Supreme Court. First, this Constitution we have doesn't set the number of Supreme Court justices. We've had as few as 6, and we've had as, well, FDR wanted to up it to 15. Some people, and I don't know the reason behind it, have said that 19 would be the ideal number. But let's say the red wave has its way, and everyone on the Supreme Court by the time the president CEO is out is an arch conservative. And then the blue wave takes over. Well, Congress can up the number of justices, and since the blue wave came in, they have a blue president, blue CEO, and he can vote in favor of that. Or even if we have a red CEO, but we have a blue Congress, 2/3 of the members of Congress can override any presidential veto. So if Congress got its act together and acted together, the president wouldn't have very much effect. The president's power basically is having Congress that either is of his party and gives him everything he wants, or is divided and can't do anything. I think that's kind of interesting. We talked about FDR when it came in. The Supreme Court had voted against 2 New Deal legislation that he was in favor, and he got kind of unhappy with them, and he tried to stack it by moving the number up to 15. Congress wouldn't go along with him, and that died there. But I mean, it's manipulating the number of Supreme Court justices is a way to change a conservative Supreme Court to a liberal one and vice versa. And this basically just goes through the history of the changes in the number on the Supreme Court.
Just to bring your attention to the time, Barry, so 11 o'clock.
I got about 3 more minutes.
If you want to take questions, I just want to remind you.
Well, thank you. And as we talked about Congress having the right to override the veto of the president, and Maestro, hit it. Now we'll see how it should work.
As your body grows bigger,
Your mind must flower,
it's great to learn.
'cause knowledge is power.
It's Schoolhouse Rocky, the chip off the block of your favorite Schoolhouse Rock. I'm just a Bill.
Woo, You sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee, but I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will, but today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." Then he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee, and I'll sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be a law. I hope and pray that they will, but today I am still just a bill.
Listen to those congressmen arguing. Is all that discussion and debate about you?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills never even get this far. I hope they decide to report on me favorably, otherwise I may die.
Die?
Yeah, die in committee. Oh, but it looks like I'm going to live. Now I go to the House of Representatives and they vote on me.
If they vote yes, what happens?
Then I go to the Senate and the whole thing starts all over again.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And if they vote for me on Capitol Hill, well, then I'm off to the White House where I'll wait in a line with a lot of other bills for the president to sign. And if he signs me, then I'll be a law. How I hope and pray that he will. But today I am still just a bill.
You mean even if the whole Congress says you should be a law, the president can still say no?
Yes, that's called a veto. If the president vetoes me, I have to go back to Congress and they vote on me again, and by that time you're so
By
old.
that time, it's very unlikely that you become a law. It's not easy to become a law, is it?
No, but how I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
He signed your bill. Now you're a law.
Oh, yes.